On the 27th of June, 1981, a man walked into a mosque in Tehran, carrying what appeared to be a tape recorder. He placed it in front of a rising political figure named Ali Khamenei, stepped back, and waited. A minute later, the device exploded, tearing through the room with a force that left Khamenei permanently paralyzed in his right arm and damaged his vocal cords in ways that have never fully healed, which is why, to this day, the man who has ruled over 80 million Iranians with absolute authority for more than 3 decades speaks in the quiet and somewhat strained voice of a man whose body carries the memory of the moment someone tried to kill him. They failed, and the world has been living with the consequences of that failure ever since. This is the story of Ali Khamenei, the second supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the architect of one of the most extensive state-sponsored terrorist networks in modern history, and one of the most enduring and most consequential dictators of the 20th and 21st centuries. A man who has imprisoned his own people, financed the killing of thousands across the Middle East, pursued nuclear weapons while lying about it to the world, and held an entire nation hostage to his ideology for over 30 years. To understand how he became that man, we have to go back to the beginning. He was born on the 17th of July, 1939, in the city of Mashhad in northeastern Iran, the son of a Shia cleric named Javad Khamenei, a scholar of modest means but considerable religious standing in his community, who had studied at the holy city of Najaf in Iraq, and who raised his family in the deeply religious atmosphere of one of the holiest cities in the Shia Muslim world. Mashhad was no ordinary city. It was and remains the resting place of Ali ibn Musa al-Rida, the 8th Imam of 12er Shia Islam, drawing millions of pilgrims from across the Islamic world every year and sustaining a community of scholars, clerics, and religious institutions that gave the city a character defined almost entirely by the priorities and the values of the clerical establishment. Growing up in Mashhad meant growing up inside that world, breathing its assumptions, absorbing its convictions, and being shaped from the very earliest years of life by an understanding that the highest calling a man could pursue was the defense and the propagation of the Islamic faith. The Iran that surrounded this deeply religious household was a country in profound tension with itself, a nation whose ancient religious identity was being systematically challenged by a dynasty that had come to power through a military coup, and that was pushing the country toward a Western-oriented secularism that the clerical establishment viewed not as progress, but as an assault on everything that made Iran what it was. The Pahlavi dynasty, established by Reza Shah in 1925 and continued by his son Mohammad Reza Shah after 1941, maintained its grip on power through a combination of Western-backed authority, aggressive modernization, and the brutal operations of Savak, the Shah's secret police, whose surveillance, torture, and elimination of political opponents made it one of the most feared intelligence services in the Middle East. It was in opposition to this regime, and in devotion to the revolutionary vision of a cleric who would eventually remake Iran entirely in his own image, that the young Khamenei would find his purpose, his identity, and ultimately his path to absolute power. His father Javad was of Azeri ethnicity, a member of the large Azeri minority concentrated in northwestern Iran, and had studied at Najaf before settling in Mashhad, where he met and married his second wife, Khadija Murdamadi, Ali's mother. She was a woman of genuine education who taught her son about Persian history, art, and literature, giving him an engagement with the broader cultural heritage of Iran that went beyond the purely religious framework of his father's world. Khamenei has since emphasized the extreme austerity of his childhood, describing a family that lived in a single room and subsisted primarily on bread, dates, and raisins. Whether this account is entirely accurate, or whether it has been shaped by the political usefulness of projecting an image of uncorrupted and humble origins, is a question worth keeping in mind, because Khamenei's management of his own public image has always been one of his most deliberate and most consistent political instruments, and the distance between the persona he has projected and the reality of how his regime has operated represents one of the most telling features of his entire career. If you are enjoying this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so you never miss a new biography. And now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching this from. It always amazes me how people from so many different corners of the world come together around stories like this one. What is clear is that the Khamenei household was one in which religious learning was the supreme value, and in which the father's standing as a respected cleric gave the family a social position that compensated for its lack of material wealth. Ali absorbed that world completely, and by the mid-1950s, he was studying in Mashhad under leading religious scholars before advancing to the holy city of Najaf in Iraq for a period of study, and then settling in Qom, the intellectual heart of Iranian Shia Islam, where the most senior ayatollahs and the most rigorous seminaries in the country were concentrated, and where the political temperature of the clerical establishment was rising steadily in response to the Shah's modernization program and its challenge to religious authority. It was in Qom in 1957 that Khamenei began studying under the man who would define the entire subsequent course of his life, a fierce and uncompromising cleric of extraordinary personal authority named Ruhollah Khomeini, who was already developing a reputation as the most dangerous and most determined critic of the Shah's government within the religious establishment, and whose vision of an Iran governed directly by Islamic law under the authority of a supreme religious jurist was, at that time, still a radical proposition, even within the world of Iranian Shia scholarship. Khamenei embraced that vision completely, and the relationship between teacher and student that began in 1957 would shape Iranian history for the next 6 decades, eventually producing a theocratic dictatorship whose consequences for the Iranian people and for the broader Middle East have been devastating in ways that neither man could fully have anticipated when they first sat down together in a seminary classroom in Qom. The political crisis that transformed Khomeini from a prominent opposition cleric into a revolutionary figurehead came in 1963, when the Shah launched his White Revolution, a program of Western-oriented modernization that included land reform, the expansion of women's rights, and a direct challenge to the economic structures that underpinned the clerical establishment's institutional power. Khamenei emerged as the most vocal and most uncompromising opponent of the White Revolution, was arrested by the Shah's government, and the resulting protests in June of 1963 left hundreds of Iranians dead in the streets, producing a wave of radicalization throughout Iranian society that would take another 16 years to fully express itself, but that permanently altered the political landscape of the country. Khamenei witnessed these events with an intensity and a fury that hardened his convictions and deepened his commitment to the cause that his teacher represented. When the Shah sent Khomeini into exile in 1964, first to Turkey and then to Iraq, Khamenei made a decision that would in retrospect prove one of the most consequential of his life. He chose to stay in Iran. He returned to Mashhad to help care for his aging father, who had become partially blind, and in doing so, he became the most capable and most committed representative of Khomeini's revolutionary movement operating inside the country, the man on the ground who kept the networks alive, and the resistance organized while the movement's spiritual leader directed operations from abroad. That decision also meant subjecting himself to the full force of the Shah's repressive apparatus, and the years that followed were marked by repeated arrests, extended periods of imprisonment, and sustained harassment by Savak that left no doubt about how seriously the Shah's government regarded the threat that Khamenei represented. He was arrested multiple times through the late 1960s and the 1970s, held in solitary confinement for months at a stretch, cut off from his family without notification of his whereabouts, and subjected to the psychological pressure that a sophisticated secret police apparatus applies with practiced efficiency to men it wants to break. The longest of these periods came in 1975, when he was detained in Tehran from January to August, 8 unbroken months of isolation designed to destroy his will and sever his connections to the movement he served. It did not break him. It hardened him, reinforcing the absolute certainty that the Shah's regime was not merely politically wrong, but morally irredeemable, and that the only acceptable response to what it represented was total and uncompromising revolutionary overthrow. Between his imprisonments, he traveled across Iran, delivering sermons that wove religious devotion together with political radicalism with increasing skill and increasing effect. In 1967, he helped translate into Farsi the work of the Egyptian Islamist scholar Sayyid Qutb, whose writing argued that secular governments across the Muslim world needed to be overthrown and replaced with states governed by Islamic law. And Khamenei endorsed the translation with a foreword, declaring with blunt and unambiguous clarity that the future belonged to Islam. He helped found the Association of Combatant Clergy in 1977, a coordinating body for the clerical opposition that would play a significant role in the revolutionary events that followed. And behind the scenes, in ways that would only become publicly known much later, he was a member of the clandestine Islamic Revolutionary Council, the 13-man body that was quietly preparing for the moment when the Shah's regime collapsed, and the question of what replaced it would need to be answered immediately and decisively. That moment arrived in the winter of 1978 and 1979. Decades of economic discontent, political repression, and accumulated resentment finally produced the mass uprising that brought hundreds of thousands of Iranians into the streets of Tehran and every major city in the country, and that made the continuation of the Shah's rule impossible. The Shah fled Iran on the 16th of January, 1979, a broken and dying man abandoned by the Western allies who had propped up his regime for 3 decades. 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khamenei landed at Mehrabad International Airport in Tehran after 14 years in exile. Greeted by millions of people in scenes of religious and revolutionary fervor that remain among the most extraordinary and most consequential images of the 20th century. 10 days after that, the last remnants of the secular government that had governed Iran since the 1920s had ceased to exist. The Islamic Republic of Iran had been born. Ali Khamenei was 39 years old, and the revolution he had spent his entire adult life working toward had finally succeeded. What he did not yet fully reveal to the world around him, and what the millions who had taken to the streets in the name of freedom and justice had not yet begun to understand, was that the dictatorship they had just overthrown was about to be replaced by something that would prove, for the Iranian people, every bit as brutal, every bit as unaccountable, and in some respects, considerably more dangerous to the wider world. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was not, despite how it has sometimes been portrayed in the years since, a simple and unified movement with a single clear vision of what Iran should become after the Shah was gone. The coalition that had brought millions of people into the streets, and that had made the continuation of Pahlavi rule impossible, was a broad and deeply divided collection of forces that included Shia clerics of varying degrees of radicalism, secular nationalists who wanted a Western-style democracy, left-wing groups with ties to the Soviet Union, liberal intellectuals who dreamed of a free press and an open society, and ordinary Iranians of every background who were united by their hatred of the Shah, but who had very different ideas about what should replace him. The revolution had succeeded because all of these groups had pushed in the same direction at the same moment. What happened in the months and years that followed was the story of how one faction within that coalition, the most ruthless and the most organizationally prepared, systematically destroyed all the others and imposed on Iran a theocratic dictatorship that none of the millions who had marched in the streets had voted for, and that many of them would spend the rest of their lives resisting at enormous personal cost. Khamenei was at the center of that process from the very beginning, and his role in consolidating clerical power over the new Islamic Republic in the turbulent years of 1979 and 1980 demonstrates with uncomfortable clarity that the man who would later present himself to the world as a reluctant and spiritually motivated leader was in reality a calculating and determined political operator who understood exactly what was at stake and exactly what needed to be done to ensure that the clerical faction came out on top. He was involved in the establishment of the Islamic Republican Party, the official government party that would dominate Iranian politics for nearly a decade, and that served as the primary instrument through which Khamenei and his allies consolidated their control over the institutions of the new state. He was given a senior role in purging the Iranian army and security forces of officers who retained loyalty to the Shah's regime, a process that was as much about eliminating potential centers of opposition to clerical rule as it was about genuine security concerns, and that resulted in the imprisonment, forced retirement, or execution of hundreds of experienced military and intelligence professionals whose only crime was having served the previous government. The speed and the completeness with which the clerical faction moved to shut out the other forces that had participated in the revolution was breathtaking, and it was made possible by a combination of organizational superiority, ideological clarity, and a willingness to use violence and intimidation against former allies that the more liberal and democratic factions of the revolutionary coalition were simply not prepared to match. By December of 1979, just 10 months after the Shah had fled and Khamenei had returned, a new constitution had been approved that established Iran as an Islamic republic governed according to the principle of Valayat-e Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which placed ultimate political and religious authority in the hands of the supreme leader and created a system of government in which the elected institutions of the state, the presidency, the parliament, the judiciary, were all ultimately subordinate to the unelected clerical leadership at the top. It was, whatever language was used to dress it up, the constitutional foundation of a dictatorship, and Khamenei had helped build it. It was against this background of revolutionary consolidation and institutional construction that the assassination attempt of June 1981 took place, and to understand its full significance, we need to understand the political environment in which it occurred. The Islamic Republic in its early years was not a stable or secure regime. It faced serious challenges from multiple directions simultaneously, from the supporters of the Shah who had fled into exile and were hoping for a counter-revolution, from the Marxist and left-wing groups that had participated in the revolution and were now being systematically crushed by the clerical government they had helped bring to power, and from within the revolutionary movement itself, where the first president of Iran since the revolution, Abul Hassan Banisadr, had been impeached at Khomeiни's instigation just days before the bombing because he was seen as pursuing an insufficiently Islamic line in government. The group that planted the bomb in the Abu Zar Mosque was the Forkan Group, a militant Islamic organization that opposed the concentration of clerical power in the hands of figures like Khamenei, and that had already assassinated several senior figures in the new regime. The bomb that was placed in front of Khamenei that June morning was concealed inside a tape recorder and detonated by remote control, tearing through the room with a force that should by any reasonable assessment have killed him. It did not. He survived, but the injuries he sustained were permanent and life-altering. The nerves in his right arm were so severely damaged that the arm has remained almost completely paralyzed ever since, and his vocal cords were injured in ways that explain the soft and somewhat strained quality of his voice that has been a constant feature of his public appearances throughout his entire time as supreme leader. The physical damage was real and serious, but the political effect of surviving the attempt was, for Khamenei, enormously useful, cementing his status as a man who had literally offered his body in service of the revolution and who had been marked by that sacrifice in a way that was visible to everyone who looked at him or listened to him speak. 6 weeks after the bombing, still not fully recovered from his injuries, Khamenei was on the ballot in the presidential elections of October 1981, elections that had been called after his predecessor as president, Mohammad Ali Rajai, had been assassinated in a separate bombing just months into his own term in office, a sign of how violently unstable the early Islamic Republic actually was beneath the surface of its revolutionary triumphalism. Khamenei won the election with a landslide that reflected both his genuine standing within the clerical establishment and the thoroughly controlled nature of Iranian electoral politics, in which the candidates who appear on the ballot are pre-approved by the religious leadership, and the definition of a free and fair election is considerably more flexible than the one used by the rest of the democratic world. He became the third president of Iran, and he would hold that office for 8 years, through one of the most devastating conflicts in the modern history of the Middle East, the Iran-Iraq War, which Saddam Hussein had launched in September 1980 with an invasion of Iranian territory that he expected to produce a quick and decisive victory, was already well underway when Khamenei took office as president, and it would dominate every aspect of Iranian political, economic, and social life throughout the entirety of his presidency. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim dictator ruling a country with a Shia majority, and his fear that the Iranian Revolution would inspire his own Shia population to rise against him was one of the primary motivations for the attack. He was backed by American weapons and American intelligence, by Gulf Arab states that were equally terrified of the revolutionary contagion that Khomeini's Iran represented, and by a Western world that had decided that whatever its reservations about Saddam Hussein, he was a more manageable and less threatening force in the region than the Islamic Republic that had humiliated the United States so comprehensively with the hostage crisis of 1979 and 1980. The war that followed was one of the most brutal and most costly conflicts of the 20th century, a grinding and attritional struggle fought in the marshes and deserts of the Iran-Iraq border that drew on the worst military technologies of the age, including the extensive use of chemical weapons by Saddam Hussein against both the Iranian forces and his own Kurdish population, and that resulted in casualties estimated at over 1 million people dead across both sides over the course of nearly 8 years of fighting. Khamenei, as president, was a central figure in the management of the war effort, visiting the front on multiple occasions and presenting himself to the Iranian public as a leader who shared the sacrifice of the soldiers fighting and dying in the mud and the heat of the border region. Behind the scenes, the evidence suggests that he was among those who favored a negotiated peace as early as 1982, when it became clear that the initial Iraqi invasion had been repelled and that Iran was in a position to negotiate from a position of relative strength. But in the Islamic Republic of 1982, the opinion of the president on a matter of this magnitude was not the opinion that determined policy. That power rested with Khamenei, who had transformed the war from a defensive struggle for Iranian survival into a religious crusade, whose stated goal was nothing less than the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime and the liberation of the holy Shia cities of Najaf and Karbala in Iraq, and who was therefore unwilling to accept any peace that fell short of total victory regardless of the human cost. And so the war continued, year after grinding year, consuming the lives of Iranian men and boys in numbers that the regime obscured from the public as much as it could, financing itself through oil revenues that were being depleted at an alarming rate, and creating a generation of Iranians who had grown up knowing nothing but conflict, rationing, and the permanent presence of death. It was during these years of war that the institutional foundations of the dictatorship that Khamenei would later perfect were being laid with a thoroughness and a deliberateness that is only fully visible in retrospect. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which Khomeini had established in the immediate aftermath of the revolution as a parallel military force loyal directly to the clerical leadership rather than to the state, was expanded dramatically during the war years, both in numbers and in the scope of its activities, becoming not merely a military organization, but an economic and political force of enormous power whose loyalty was bound to the supreme leader personally, rather than to any institution or constitutional arrangement. The intelligence and security apparatus that had replaced SAVAK was reorganized and expanded, developing the surveillance and repression capabilities that would be deployed with increasing intensity against the Iranian people in the decades that followed. And the network of religious foundations the banyads, that controlled vast swaths of the Iranian economy, were brought under tighter clerical control, creating the economic infrastructure of a system in which political loyalty and access to resources were inseparable from each other in ways that made genuine opposition to the regime extraordinarily difficult to sustain. When Khamenei finally agreed to accept a ceasefire with Iraq in August 1988, describing the decision in terms that suggested it felt to him like drinking poison, the war ended without the victory he had promised, and without the liberation of the holy cities he had used to justify. 6 more years of killing after the initial Iraqi invasion had been repelled. Iran had lost hundreds of thousands of its people, its economy had been devastated, and its international isolation had deepened to the point where it had almost no meaningful allies in the world beyond Syria and a handful of then Syria. Non-state actors it was already beginning to cultivate as instruments of regional power. Khamenei, who had served as president throughout the war, emerged from it with his political position secure and his reputation within the clerical establishment intact, which was a considerable achievement given the magnitude of what the country had just been through. He was re-elected to the presidency in 1985 with 87% of the vote, a figure that tells you everything you need to know about the nature of Iranian democracy under the Islamic Republic, and nothing whatsoever about the genuine feelings of the Iranian people toward the man who governed them. And then, in June of 1989, everything changed. Ayatollah Khamenei died of a heart attack on the 3rd of June, and the Islamic Republic faced the question it had been dreading and deferring for years. The question of who could possibly replace the man whose personal authority had been the foundation on which the entire system rested, and whose death left a vacancy at the top of the Iranian power structure that no one in the clerical establishment had anywhere near the religious standing or the political weight to fill in a way that would be immediately and universally accepted. The assembly of experts that met the following day to deliberate on the succession was a body of senior clerics whose task was, in constitutional terms, to identify the most qualified religious jurist in Iran to serve as the next supreme leader, and the most qualified religious jurist in Iran by any objective measure of Islamic scholarship was emphatically not Ali Khamenei, whose religious studies had been cut short in the 1960s when he returned to Mashhad to care for his father, and who had never completed the full course of training that the position technically required. Multiple figures within the clerical establishment regarded him as underqualified for the role, and the deliberations of the assembly reflected that concern with a frankness that made the eventual outcome all the more remarkable. What the assembly needed was not the most learned cleric in Iran, but the most politically reliable one, the man who could be trusted to maintain the system that Khamenei had built without either dismantling it in the direction of reform or destabilizing it through the assertion of a personal authority that the other senior clerics would not accept. Khamenei was that man. He was elected supreme leader of Iran on the 4th of June, 1989, by 60 votes to 14, at 50 years of age, in a decision that even those who voted for him understood was a compromise born of necessity rather than a recognition of outstanding religious qualification. An unverified claim circulated that Khamenei himself had privately indicated his preference for Khamenei as his successor, a claim that was politically convenient enough that its unverifiability did not prevent it from being widely repeated. And with that vote, the man who had survived a bomb in a mosque, who had spent years in solitary confinement, who had served as a wartime resident, and who had spent his entire adult life in the service of a revolutionary ideology that brooked no compromise with its opponents, became the absolute ruler of the Islamic Republic of Iran, with powers that dwarfed those of any president or prime minister in the Western world, and with a system of government specifically designed to ensure that no one could challenge or remove him. When Ali Khamenei assumed the position of Supreme Leader of Iran in June of 1989, the world was changing with a speed and a comprehensiveness that created both threats and opportunities for the new ruler of the Islamic Republic. And what distinguished Khamenei from the moment he took power was the clarity, and the cold-bloodedness with which he identified those opportunities and moved to exploit them before anyone else in the region had fully grasped what he was doing. The Soviet Union was collapsing, taking with it the ideological framework that had organized global politics for 4 decades and leaving behind landscape of power vacuums, failed states, and displaced populations that a sufficiently patient and sufficiently ruthless regional power could fill with its own proxies, its own ideology, and its own instruments of influence. The Middle East was in flux in ways that it had not been since the colonial powers had drawn its borders at the end of the First World War. And Iran, sitting at the geographic center of that turbulent region with its oil wealth, its large population, its battle-hardened Revolutionary Guard, and its supreme leader's absolute determination to make it the dominant power in the Islamic world, was positioned to take advantage of that flux in ways that Khamenei, consumed by the war with Iraq and by the management of the revolution's internal contradictions, had never been fully able to do. The instrument through which Khamenei chose to project Iranian power beyond his country's borders was not the conventional military force of the Iranian army, which was exhausted and depleted after 8 years of war with Iraq, and which carried with it the political complications of any state military operating in foreign territory. It was instead the network of non-state proxy forces that Iran had been carefully cultivating since the earliest years of the revolution. Organizations that could operate in the spaces between states, that could plausibly deny direct Iranian control when it was politically convenient to do so, and that could advance Iranian strategic interests with a flexibility and a deniability that no conventional military force could match. Under Khamenei, this proxy network was expanded, professionalized, and funded on a scale that transformed it from a collection of loosely affiliated militant groups into one of the most sophisticated and most deadly instruments of state-sponsored terrorism that the modern world has ever seen. The crown jewel of that network, the organization that represented Khamenei's most significant and most consequential investment in regional power projection, was Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militant group that had been formed in the early 1980s in the context of the Lebanese Civil War and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Hezbollah had been inspired by the Iranian Revolution and had received Iranian support from the very beginning of its existence, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps providing training, funding, and ideological guidance to the nascent organization in its earliest years. Under Khamenei, that relationship was transformed from one of general support and shared ideology into something much closer to a full operational partnership, with Iran providing Hezbollah with the financial resources, the weapons, the training, and the strategic direction that turned it from a local Lebanese militant group into a regional military force of extraordinary capability and a global terrorist organization with reach extending far beyond the borders of the Middle East. The scale of Iranian financial support for Hezbollah under Khamenei has been estimated by Western intelligence agencies at hundreds of millions of dollars per year at its peak, with figures ranging from $100 million to $700 million annually depending on the period and the source, making it one of the most generously funded non-state armed organizations in the history of modern warfare. That funding paid for the rockets and missiles that Hezbollah fired into Israel across the Lebanese border in the conflicts of 2006 and the Tiva years that followed, for the tunnels it dug beneath the Lebanese-Israeli frontier to enable cross-border attacks, for the training camps in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, where its fighters were prepared for operations that ranged from guerrilla warfare to precision missile strikes, and for the global network of cells and operatives that Hezbollah maintained in countries across South America, West Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe, ready to be activated for terrorist operations when Khamenei decided that the political moment required it. Hezbollah's activities on Iran's behalf were not confined to Lebanon or to operations against Israel. The organization served as a direct instrument of Iranian state policy in ways that made it, in practical terms, an extension of Iranian foreign policy operating under a different flag. When Iran wanted to project force in Syria to protect the Assad regime, it was Hezbollah fighters, alongside Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers, who provided the ground forces that kept Bashar al-Assad in power after the Syrian civil war began in 2011, fighting and dying in a foreign country's civil war in service of an Iranian strategic interest that had nothing to do with the welfare of the Syrian people and everything to do with Khamenei's determination to maintain Iran's land corridor to Lebanon and the Mediterranean coast. When Iran wanted to demonstrate its capacity for global reach in response to American or Israeli provocations, it was Hezbollah's international cells that were activated, producing attacks and attempted attacks on Israeli and Jewish targets in countries as far apart as Argentina, Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Thailand. The most devastating of Hezbollah's international terrorist operations during the Khamenei era was the bombing of a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in July of 1994, in which 85 people were killed and hundreds more injured in the single deadliest terrorist attack in the history of Latin America. Argentine prosecutors and international investigators spent years building a case that attributed responsibility for the attack to Hezbollah operatives acting on Iranian orders, with a direct line of authorization running back to senior figures in the Iranian government, including, according to the Argentine indictment, Khamenei himself. Iran has consistently denied responsibility, but the weight of evidence assembled over 2 decades of investigation has been sufficiently compelling that Interpol has issued red notices for the arrest of several senior Iranian officials in connection with the attack, notices that remain active to this day. The second major pillar of Khamenei's proxy network was Hamas, the Palestinian Islamist organization that had been founded in 1987 and that had gradually displaced the secular Palestinian Liberation Organization as the dominant political and military force in the Gaza Strip over the course of the 1990s and 2000s. Hamas is a Sunni Muslim organization which makes its alliance with Shia Iran a marriage of strategic convenience rather than religious solidarity. But Khamenei has never allowed theological differences to interfere with strategic utility, and Hamas's dedication to the destruction of Israel and its willingness to use terrorist violence against Israeli civilians made it a natural partner for an Iranian regime whose opposition to Israel's existence has been one of the most consistent and most loudly proclaimed elements of its foreign policy since the revolution. Iranian funding for Hamas has paid for the rockets fired from Gaza into Israeli cities, for the tunnel networks beneath the Gaza-Israel border, for the training of Hamas fighters and commanders, and for the organizational infrastructure that enabled Hamas to govern the Gaza Strip as a de facto state while simultaneously maintaining its capacity for military operations against Israel. If you are enjoying this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so you never miss a new biography. And now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching this from. Beyond Hezbollah and Hamas, Khamenei constructed a web of proxy relationships and client militias across the broader Middle East that gave Iran a degree of regional influence entirely disproportionate to what its conventional military power and its sanctioned and struggling economy would otherwise have allowed. In Yemen, Iran cultivated and armed the Houthi movement, a Zadi Shia rebel organization that had been fighting against the Yemeni government since the early 2000s, providing it with weapons including ballistic missiles and armed drones that the Houthis used to attack Saudi Arabian cities, oil infrastructure, and international shipping lanes in the Red Sea with a regularity and a destructiveness that made them one of the most significant security threats in the region, and that served Iranian strategic interests by tying down Saudi Arabia, Iran's primary regional rival, in a costly and unwinnable military intervention that has been described as Saudi Arabia's Vietnam. The Houthi slogan, which combines death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews, and victory to Islam in a single chant, was not written in Yemen. Its ideological DNA runs directly back to Tehran and to the worldview that Khamenei has spent his entire career constructing and propagating. In Iraq, the American invasion of 2003 that overthrew Saddam Hussein produced, from Khamenei's perspective, both a significant threat and an extraordinary opportunity. The threat was the presence of a large and powerful American military force on Iran's western border, an uncomfortable reminder of American military capacity and American willingness to use it against regimes that Washington regarded as hostile. The opportunity was the removal of Iran's most dangerous regional enemy and the creation of a power vacuum in a country with a Shia majority population that Iran was uniquely positioned to fill. Khamenei moved to exploit that opportunity with a speed and a thoroughness that caught the American military and political establishment largely by surprise, flooding Iraq with Iranian intelligence operatives, financing and arming a constellation of Shia militia groups that became collectively known as the Popular Mobilization Forces, and gradually building a degree of Iranian political and military influence over Iraqi institutions that has made Iraq, despite its formal sovereignty, one of the most significant arenas of Iranian strategic power in the entire Middle East. The weapons that Iran provided to its Iraqi proxies were used not only against other Iraqis, but against American soldiers, and the specifically designed explosive devices known as explosively formed penetrators that Iranian military engineers developed, and that Iranian supply networks delivered to Shia militia groups in Iraq were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American service members during the occupation, a fact that made the Iran-proxy relationship in Iraq one of the most direct and most deadly examples of Iranian state-sponsored violence against American forces in the history of the two countries' long and bitter confrontation. Khamenei authorized those weapons transfers knowing exactly what they would be used for, and the deaths of American soldiers that resulted were, from his perspective, an acceptable and indeed desirable cost of maintaining pressure on the American presence in his region. In Syria, as the civil war that erupted in 2011 threatened to bring down the government of Bashar al-Assad, Khamenei made the decision to intervene with a totality and a commitment that went far beyond what most observers initially anticipated. Assad's Syria was Iran's most important Arab ally, the crucial link in the land corridor that connected Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to the Mediterranean coast, and its fall to the rebel forces, many of whom were backed by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states that were Iran's regional rivals, would have been a strategic catastrophe for the entire architecture of Iranian regional power that Khamenei had been building for 2 decades. Iran deployed Revolutionary Guard officers, funded and armed Hezbollah fighters, and recruited Shia militia members from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to fight in Syria, creating a multinational Shia fighting force operating under Iranian strategic direction that played a decisive role in keeping Assad in power, and that demonstrated, with brutal clarity, the true scale and the true nature of what Khamenei had built since he had taken power in 1989. The nuclear program that Khamenei presided over and expanded throughout his time as supreme leader represented the ultimate expression of his determination to make Iran a power that the world could not ignore and could not easily threaten. Iran's nuclear ambitions predated the Islamic Republic, having begun under the Shah with American assistance in the 1950s and 60s. But under Khamenei, the program was developed with an urgency and a secrecy that reflected its true purpose, far more honestly than the official Iranian position, which maintained with unwavering consistency that the entire program was intended exclusively for civilian energy generation. The claim that a country sitting on some of the largest oil and gas reserves on the planet needed to develop nuclear power for energy purposes was, to put it as charitably as possible, not entirely convincing, and the decades of concealment, the construction of secret underground enrichment facilities at places like Fordo and Natanz, the obstruction of international inspectors, and the development of enrichment capabilities far beyond what any civilian power program could require, all pointed unmistakably toward a regime that was developing at minimum the capability to produce nuclear weapons and was keeping that option as close to the surface as it possibly could, without triggering the kind of international military response that even Khamenei had to take seriously. The international community's efforts to constrain the Iranian nuclear program produced the nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, signed in 2015 between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Germany, which offered Iran relief from the crippling economic sanctions that had been slowly strangling its economy in exchange for verifiable limits on its enrichment activities and intrusive international inspection of its nuclear facilities. The deal represented a significant diplomatic achievement for the Obama administration and for the European powers that had spent years negotiating it, and it produced a genuine, if temporary, reduction in the immediate nuclear threat that Iran represented. When President Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement in 2018, citing its failure to address Iran's ballistic missile program and its regional proxy activities, Iran responded by gradually exceeding the enrichment limits the deal had imposed. And by the early 2020s, Iranian uranium enrichment had reached levels of purity that brought it to within a technical step of weapons-grade material, a development that Israeli and American intelligence agencies regarded as an existential threat that could not be allowed to continue indefinitely. The crisis that had been building for decades finally reached its most acute expression in 2023 and 2024, when Hamas, armed and funded by Iran and coordinated with Hezbollah in ways that left no serious doubt about the extent of Iranian involvement in the planning, launched the most devastating terrorist attack in Israeli history on the 7th of October, 2023, killing over 1,200 people in southern Israel in a single morning of violence whose scale and brutality shocked the world and produced an Israeli military response in Gaza of an intensity that reshaped the entire security landscape of the Middle East. Khamenei celebrated the attack publicly. He praised the Hamas fighters who had carried it out. And in doing so, he revealed, with a clarity that required no interpretation, exactly what the decades of funding and arming and training had been for, and exactly what the network he had built was designed to produce. The consequences for Iran were severe and direct in ways that Khamenei had perhaps not fully anticipated. Israel, which had been absorbing Iranian proxy attacks and Iranian nuclear provocation for decades, while limiting its responses to targeted assassinations and occasional airstrikes, concluded in the aftermath of October 7th that the strategy of containment and deterrence that had governed its approach to the Iranian threat was no longer sufficient. And in 2025, a combination of Israeli military strikes and American military action destroyed a significant portion of Iran's nuclear infrastructure and dealt serious damage to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its command structure in a series of operations that represented the most direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran in the history of the two countries' long hostility. The Iran that emerged from those strikes was weakened, its most prized strategic asset badly damaged, its proxy network disrupted, its regional ambitions at least temporarily set back by the most serious military reversal the regime had experienced since the end of the Iran-Iraq War. But Khamenei, the man who had survived a bomb in a mosque, who had endured years of solitary confinement, who had outlasted the Shah and Saddam Hussein and 4 American presidents who had each in their turn attempted to constrain or confront him, was still in power, still ruling with absolute authority over the Iranian people, and still presiding over the system of repression and terror that he had spent his entire life building. There is a particular kind of cruelty that belongs to dictators who rule in the name of God, because they add to the ordinary instruments of political repression the secret police, the rigged courts, the midnight arrests, the torture chambers, the additional weight of divine sanction. The claim that resistance to their authority is not merely illegal, but spiritually wrong, not merely dangerous, but morally condemned, not merely punishable by the state, but offensive to the creator of the universe himself. Ali Khamenei has ruled Iran in exactly that manner for more than 3 decades. And the suffering that his regime has inflicted on the Iranian people in the name of Islamic governance represents one of the most sustained and most comprehensive assaults on human dignity in the modern history of the Middle East, carried out not by a foreign occupier or an invading army, but by a man who claims to rule in the name of the very faith that the majority of his victims also hold, and that they have never been allowed to practice on their own terms and in their own way. To understand what Khamenei's dictatorship has meant for ordinary Iranians, we have to understand the architecture of control that he has built and refined over the course of his time in power, because it is not a crude or simple system of repression, but a sophisticated and multi-layered apparatus that operates simultaneously at the level of law, economics, culture, religion, and physical violence. And that has been designed with the specific purpose of making organized opposition to the regime as difficult, as dangerous, and as costly as possible for the people who attempt it. At the most visible level, there is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the parallel military force that Khomeini established in 1979, and that Khamenei has expanded and deepened into one of the most powerful institutions in the entire country, with approximately 125,000 members, its own navy, its own air force, its own intelligence service, its own construction and business empire worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and a direct personal loyalty to the supreme leader that makes it the ultimate guarantor of his continued power and the ultimate instrument of his will against anyone who challenges it. Below the Revolutionary Guard, there is the Basij, a volunteer paramilitary force of ideologically committed members who serve as the regime's eyes and ears at the street level, monitoring the behavior and the opinions of ordinary Iranians in their neighborhoods, their workplaces, and their communities, and who have been deployed repeatedly over the years as the front line, troops of violent suppression whenever protests against the regime have broken out in Iranian cities. The Basij were the men on motorcycles who drove into crowds of protesters in Tehran in 2009, beating men and women with batons and firing on crowds with live ammunition. They were the men who arrested university students and dragged them from their dormitories in the middle of the night. They were the men who appeared at family gatherings and workplaces to deliver the unmistakable message that the regime was watching, and that the cost of dissent was not merely the risk of arrest, but the permanent contamination of every relationship and every opportunity in a person's life. And then there is the morality police, the Gasht-e-Irshad, the guidance patrol that Khamenei ordered into existence in 2005 as a dedicated force for enforcing the Islamic dress codes and behavioral norms that the regime imposes on Iranian society. And that has become one of the most hated and most visible symbols of the dictatorship's intrusion into the most intimate aspects of ordinary Iranian life. The morality police patrol the streets of Iranian cities with the authority to stop, question, detain, and arrest any woman whose hijab is deemed insufficiently compliant with the regime's standards, any couple whose public behavior is considered inappropriate, any individual whose appearance or conduct violates the ever-shifting and entirely arbitrarily enforced codes of Islamic propriety that the regime uses as instruments of social control. They operate outside the normal judicial system, reporting directly to Khamenei rather than to the civilian government, accountable to no one but the supreme leader himself. And their record of abuse, harassment, and violence against the people they are supposedly guiding has been documented in exhaustive and horrifying detail by human rights organizations across the world. It was the morality police who killed Mahsa Amini. In September of 2022, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini was detained by the Gasht-e-Irshad in Tehran on the allegation that she was wearing her hijab improperly. She was taken to a detention center for what was described as re-education. Within hours, she was in a coma. 3 days later, she was dead, her body bearing the marks of the beating she had received while in the custody of the men who were supposed to be guiding her toward proper Islamic behavior. The regime's initial response was to deny that anything improper had occurred, to claim that she had suffered a pre-existing medical condition, to suggest that the young woman was somehow responsible for her own death in the hands of the state that had arrested her for the crime of wearing a headscarf in a manner that someone in authority had decided was insufficient. The Iranian people did not believe them, and the protests that erupted across Iran in the weeks and months that followed Mahsa Amini's death were unlike anything the country had seen since the revolution itself, not merely in their scale, which was extraordinary, but in their character and in their demands, which went far beyond the specific question of the hijab requirement, and represented a direct and explicit challenge to the entire system of clerical rule that Khamenei had spent 33 years constructing and defending. The slogan that echoed through the streets of Tehran and Mashhad and Isfahan and dozens of other Iranian cities was not a demand for reform or a request for a new government. It was woman, life, freedom. Three words that in their simplicity and their universality represented the most comprehensive rejection of everything Khamenei's regime stood for that the Iranian people had ever publicly expressed, and that young Iranian women expressed most powerfully and most visibly by removing their hijabs in public, burning them in the streets, and cutting their hair in acts of defiance that were watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world on social media, that the regime desperately tried and repeatedly failed to shut down. Khamenei's response to the protests was the response of a man who has spent his entire life dealing with opposition through the same basic method: the application of overwhelming force combined with the systematic denial of legitimacy to those who resist. The Revolutionary Guard and the Basij were deployed against the protesters with live ammunition, tear gas, and mass arrests. Hundreds of people were killed in the streets. Thousands were arrested and disappeared into the prison system that the regime maintains for exactly this purpose, a system in which the rights of the detained exist only on paper, and in which the distance between arrest and execution can be measured in weeks rather than years. The regime announced the execution of several protesters on charges of waging war against God, the elastic and infinitely applicable charge that the Islamic Republic has used to justify the killing of its political opponents since the earliest days of the revolution, a charge that says more about the nature of the regime than anything its critics could devise. The economic catastrophe that Khamenei's governance has inflicted on the Iranian people provides another dimension of the suffering that his dictatorship has produced, one that is less dramatic than the images of protesters being shot in the streets, but that has touched the lives of ordinary Iranians with a pervasiveness and a persistence that the occasional outbreak of street violence cannot match. Iran is a country of extraordinary natural wealth, sitting on the fourth largest proven oil reserves and the second largest natural gas reserves in the world, resources that should, by any reasonable calculation, have made it one of the most prosperous countries in its region and one of the more comfortable places in the world to live an ordinary middle-class life. Instead, decades of international sanctions imposed in response to the nuclear program and the regime's sponsorship of terrorism, combined with the catastrophic economic mismanagement of a system in which the Revolutionary Guard controls vast swaths of the economy for its own benefit rather than for the benefit of the Iranian people, have produced an economy that has consistently underperformed its potential by staggering margins. Official unemployment has run at around 10% for years, a figure that almost certainly understates the true extent of joblessness in an economy where youth unemployment is dramatically higher, and where the educated young people who represent Iran's greatest human resource have been leaving the country in a brain drain of historic proportions, voting with their feet for the future that Khamenei's Iran denies them. The Iranian rial has lost the overwhelming majority of its value against major international currencies during Khamenei's time in power, eroding the savings and the purchasing power of ordinary Iranians with a relentlessness that has made economic anxiety a permanent feature of daily life for the majority of the population. The sanctions that have been imposed in response to the nuclear program and the proxy terrorism have cut Iran off from the international financial system in ways that have made normal economic activity extraordinarily difficult, raising the cost of everything from medicine to manufacturing equipment, and hitting the ordinary people of Iran with a force that the regime's leadership, insulated by the Revolutionary Guard's economic empire and by the corruption that is endemic at every level of the system, has never had to experience personally. The political manipulation through which Khamenei has maintained the fiction of democratic governance while ensuring that no challenge to his authority can ever succeed through the electoral process represents another dimension of the comprehensive control that he exercises over Iranian society. Elections are held in Iran, and this fact is sometimes cited as evidence of the Islamic Republic's distinction from the more nakedly authoritarian regimes of the Middle East, the kingdoms and emirates, where the pretense of popular participation in governance is not even maintained. But Iranian elections are democratic in the same sense that a game is fair when one player is allowed to choose which of the other players are permitted to participate, and the Guardian Council's power to disqualify candidates for the presidency, the parliament, and other elected offices has been used with increasing aggressiveness under Khamenei to ensure that the range of political opinion permitted to compete for office narrows steadily toward the position that the supreme leader finds acceptable. The brief reform era of the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the moderate President Mohammad Khatami won election on a platform of liberalization and attempted to push the boundaries of what was permitted in Iranian political life, demonstrated both the limited space that exists within the Iranian system for genuine political change and the hard limits that Khamenei is prepared to enforce when he judges that those boundaries are being approached. Khatami's reform agenda was tolerated while it remained within limits that Khamenei could manage, and was systematically dismantled when it began to generate popular momentum that threatened to exceed those limits, with the Guardian Council moving in 2004 to disqualify thousands of reformist candidates from standing in parliamentary elections and effectively ending the reform era by administrative decree rather than by persuading the Iranian people that conservatism was preferable. The stolen election of 2009, in which Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was declared the winner of a presidential contest that credible evidence strongly suggests was rigged on Khamenei's instructions, produced the Green Movement protests that represented the first truly mass challenge to Khamenei's personal authority since he had taken power 20 years earlier, and his response to those protests established the template that he would apply again and again in the years that followed. Mass arrests, internet censorship, the closure of universities, the deployment of security forces with instructions to use whatever level of violence was necessary to restore order, and afterward, the systematic imprisonment and persecution of the movement's leaders, many of whom spent years in prison and some of whom are still there, their lives destroyed by the act of standing in a street and demanding that their votes be counted honestly. The international isolation that has been the inevitable consequence of Khamenei's combination of nuclear ambition, proxy terrorism, and domestic repression has driven Iran into the arms of the other major powers that share its interest in challenging the American-led international order, most significantly Russia and China, whose relationships with Tehran have deepened considerably in the years since the collapse of the nuclear deal and the reimposition of American sanctions. Russia and Iran have found common cause in Syria, where both powers have invested military force and political capital in keeping Assad in power, and the relationship between the two countries deepened further and more dangerously after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, when Iran became one of the primary suppliers of the Shait-armed drones that Russia has used to attack Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure, extending the reach of Khamenei's destructive influence far beyond the Middle East and into the heart of Europe. China has been Iran's primary economic lifeline, purchasing Iranian oil in volumes that have cushioned the impact of Western sanctions, and providing the economic relationship that has allowed Khamenei to absorb the costs of his confrontational foreign policy. Without the kind of economic collapse that might otherwise have forced a reassessment of his strategic choices. The question of what comes after Khamenei has been one of the most consistently discussed and most persistently unanswered questions in the study of the Islamic Republic for at least the last decade. As the supreme leader has moved through his 80s, and as the question of the succession has become impossible to avoid, Khamenei has managed the succession question with the same combination of deliberate opacity and strategic calculation that has characterized his management of every other major challenge of his time in power, never publicly designating a successor, occasionally allowing his son, Mu'taba, to be mentioned in connection with the position in ways that have generated speculation without ever constituting a formal announcement, and maintaining the uncertainty about who will follow him as one more instrument of control over the clerical establishment whose support he requires to govern and whose collective fear of a destabilizing succession crisis gives him leverage over even those within the system who might otherwise challenge him. What is clear is that the system Khamenei has built over more than 3 decades is not dependent on his personal presence in the way that Khomeini's authority had been dependent on the first supreme leader's extraordinary personal charisma and religious prestige. The Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, the intelligence services, the Banyad economic empire, the proxy network that stretches from Lebanon to Yemen, to Iraq, to Gaza. These are institutional structures with their own momentum and their own interests, and they will not simply dissolve when the man who has managed and expanded them is gone. The dictatorship that Khamenei built has been designed to outlast him, and the tragedy for the Iranian people is that even his death, which will come as it comes to everyone, may not bring them the freedom that millions of them have been risking their lives to demand for the better part of 4 decades. Because the deepest and most lasting damage that Ali Khamenei has done is not to the Iranian economy, which could in theory be rebuilt, nor to Iran's international standing, which could in theory be restored, nor even to the tens of thousands of people he has imprisoned, tortured, and killed in the service of his ideology, whose suffering is real and permanent and irreversible, but whose numbers, however large, represent a fraction of the population that has lived under his rule. The deepest damage is to the possibility of trust, the possibility that the institutions of a state can be made to serve the people who live under them, rather than the ideology of the man who controls them. The possibility that the extraordinary civilization and the extraordinary human talent that Iran possesses can be turned toward the flourishing of the Iranian people, rather than toward the ambitions of a clerical dictatorship that has always regarded its own people primarily as subjects to be controlled, rather than citizens to be served. The young Iranian women who took off their hijabs in the streets in 2022 and cut their hair in front of riot police armed with live ammunition were not merely protesting a dress code. They were asserting, at the cost of their safety, and in some cases their lives, the fundamental and inalienable human claim that no government, no matter how it dresses its authority in the language of God and revolution, has the right to make of an entire people a permanent prisoner of its own ideology. That claim has not been answered. It has not been silenced. And the history of the world suggests strongly that it never can be, not permanently, not completely, not in the end. Ali Khamenei, the man behind Iran's reign of terror, the supreme leader who funded terrorists and crushed his own people, the cleric who turned a revolution into a prison, is still in power as these words are written. But the women of Iran are still in the streets. And history, which has a long memory and a longer arc than any single dictatorship, is still being written.